Every man, woman, and child in the territory of New Mexico knew the name Jacob Garrison, except for the one woman who could have saved him from himself. The year was 1883, and the sun had a way of pressing down on the town of Caldwell Creek like a flat iron on wet cotton, heavy and relentless and mean. Caldwell Creek sat in a shallow valley between two ridges of red rock, a town of maybe 400 souls if you counted the miners who drifted in and out with the silver seasons, and the talk that moved through its single main street was as constant and necessary as water. People talked about the weather. They talked about the price of beef. They talked about the Apache raids that had quieted some since General Crook had pushed south, though nobody fully trusted the quiet. And more than anything else in those dust-thick days of late summer, they talked about Jacob Garrison. He had ridden into Caldwell Creek 11 months ago on a black horse so tall and well-muscled it made the men at the livery straighten up just to look at it. Jacob himself was 28 years old, lean in the way a good knife is lean, with dark eyes that had seen enough to be quiet about it and hands that were equally useful for roping cattle or settling arguments. He had come from somewhere east of El Paso, though the stories about exactly where varied depending on who was telling them. Some said he had ridden with the Texas Rangers for 3 years and left under circumstances that were honorable but private. Some said he had once stopped a stage robbery single-handed outside of Santa Fe, disarming 4 men without firing a shot. Some said he had a way with horses that bordered on the supernatural, that animals who had never been broken walked up to him in open fields like they had been waiting for him specifically. The women of Caldwell Creek talked about the way he looked when he walked out of the barber shop on Saturday mornings, clean-shaved and unhurried, hat brim low and boots loud on the boardwalk. The men talked about his skill with a rope, the way he had helped the Harker brothers move 600 head of cattle across difficult terrain in record time last spring. The Reverend's wife talked about his attendance at Sunday services, which she found encouraging. The Reverend himself had reservations he kept mostly to himself. And through all of this, through 11 months of being the most discussed, most speculated about, most admired and most wondered over man in the territory, Jacob Garrison had remained fundamentally alone. He boarded at Mrs. Callahan's rooming house, took his meals when he remembered to, worked cattle drives when the season called for it, and in the evenings sat on the front porch of the rooming house reading whatever books he could trade for at the general store, which was not many, but he read them thoroughly. He was not an unfriendly man. He was not cold or remote. He greeted people by name when he knew them, held doors open for the elderly, and had once spent an entire afternoon helping old Hector Vega repair his fence after a windstorm knocked 3 panels flat, refusing any payment for it. He simply did not belong to anyone, and the town of Caldwell Creek, which liked to belong to things and have things belonging to it, found this quality both fascinating and slightly disturbing. Nobody thought to ask Jacob Garrison what he thought about any of it, because nobody really asked Jacob Garrison anything personal at all. He had a way of answering questions that made you feel you had received a full response even when you had received almost nothing, and over time people stopped trying to dig deeper. They just watched him and talked about what they saw, which was considerable. Julia Dawson arrived in Caldwell Creek on a Thursday morning in September, on the southbound stage from Albuquerque, and she arrived with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, a crate of books, and the absolute focused intention of getting a school built and running before the first frost. She was 24 years old, with dark red hair that she kept pinned up in a practical knot and gray eyes that missed very little. She had a schoolteacher's posture, straight and deliberate, and a schoolteacher's patience, which was different from ordinary patience in that it was not passive. It was active, watchful, and it had edges. She had taken the teaching position in Caldwell Creek after reading a notice in the Albuquerque paper that had described the territory as promising and the need as urgent. Both of these things had appealed to her. She was not running from anything in Albuquerque exactly, though she had left behind an understanding with a man named Gerald Whitmore that had dissolved quietly the previous spring when she had realized with terrible clarity that Gerald Whitmore found her intelligence more troubling than attractive. She did not hold this against him. She simply left. The stage driver, a weathered man named Pete, helped her down with her trunks and pointed her toward the general store with instructions to ask for Mayor Aldrich, who had arranged her accommodations. Julia thanked him, picked up her carpetbag, and looked up and down the main street of Caldwell Creek with the calm assessment of someone taking inventory. She noticed the hotel, the saloon, the blacksmith, the church at the far end of the street, the general store, the assier's office, the livery, and a rooming house with a green door. She noticed the dry goods store had a broken window that had been covered with oilcloth. She noticed there were more men than women on the street at this hour. She noticed a man reading on the porch of the rooming house with the green door, a dark-haired man with long legs stretched out in front of him, and a book held in both hands, and she noticed this not because anything in particular struck her about him, but because he was the only person on the street who was not already staring at her. Everyone else on the main street of Caldwell Creek had stopped what they were doing to look at the woman who had arrived on the stage. The two men outside the barber shop. The woman sweeping the steps of the dry goods store. The boy rolling a hoop along the boardwalk who let the hoop fall and roll into the street unnoticed. Julia was accustomed to being looked at when she arrived somewhere new, and she found it neither flattering nor troubling. She simply walked toward the general store with her carpetbag in hand and her two trunks left temporarily on the stage platform, trusting that someone would see to them. What she did not do in those first minutes in Caldwell Creek was ask anyone about the man reading on the porch. She had things to do. Mayor Aldrich was a small, round man with spectacular mutton-chop whiskers and an air of importance that was genuine but slightly apologetic, as though he knew his importance was the biggest thing available in a small place and was slightly embarrassed by the ratio. He met Julia at the general store with great warmth, introduced her to his wife Margaret, who was tall and kind and immediately practical about the matter of Julia's trunks, and explained her accommodations, which were 2 rooms at the back of the schoolhouse property, a space that had been used for storage but had been recently cleaned out and furnished with a cot, a washstand, a small iron stove, and a table. "The schoolhouse itself is nearly finished," Mayor Aldrich said, with the particular brightness of a man describing something that was not quite as finished as he was about to claim. "Another week, perhaps 2, and the carpenters will have it fully ready." "Who are the carpenters?" Julia asked. "Benny Walsh and his son Tom. Good workers. Tom is thorough if not quick." "I would like to see the building today," Julia said. Mayor Aldrich blinked. "Of course, certainly." The schoolhouse was a rectangular building at the edge of town, past the church and along a dirt track that wandered toward the eastern ridge. It had 4 walls and most of a roof and no windows yet, the window frames cut and waiting but the glass not yet arrived from the supply wagon out of Santa Fe. Julia walked through it carefully, measuring it with her eyes, noting where the light would fall in the afternoon, where the stove should go for best warmth in winter, how many desks the floor could reasonably hold. She asked Mayor Aldrich 4 or 5 questions he was unable to answer fully, made a list in a small notebook she produced from her carpetbag, and thanked him for his time. She did not begin to settle into Caldwell Creek so much as she began to organize it around her purposes, quietly and without making a fuss about it. She introduced herself to the families with school-age children, going door to door the first 2 days, which the town found remarkable. She arranged with the general store to have supplies delivered. She wrote letters to the superintendent of education in Santa Fe requesting specific textbooks. She visited the church and spoke with the Reverend Stokes about borrowing hymnals that also served as early reading primers, which he found an interesting approach and agreed to. Through all of this, she heard Jacob Garrison's name approximately 37 times in her first 4 days in Caldwell Creek. She knew this because she counted, not out of interest in the man himself, but out of a sociologist's fascination with how a town could collectively be in love with a single subject. It was at the dry goods store where she first truly noticed the phenomenon. "You'll want to meet Jacob Garrison," said Mabel Prout, who ran the dry goods store with her husband Carl and who had taken an immediate, vigorous liking to Julia. "Everyone does. He's the most remarkable man in the territory. He once rode 40 miles in a night to bring the doctor to the Harker homestead when their youngest got the fever." "That was kind of him," Julia said, examining a bolt of blue fabric she was considering for curtains in the schoolhouse. "Kind. It was more than kind, it was heroic. And he never spoke a word about it himself, not a word. We only know because Dr. Patterson told us." "Very admirable," Julia said, and moved on to consider the cost of whitewash. She heard about Jacob Garrison from Pete the stage driver, who told her about the cattle drive. She heard about him from Mrs. Callahan, who ran the rooming house with the green door and who mentioned with considerable feeling that he was her finest boarder, and that she had tried more than once to feed him up because he worked too hard and forgot to eat. She heard about him from the Harker brothers themselves, who stopped her on the street to introduce themselves, and who could not speak for 3 minutes without bringing him into the conversation. She heard about him from Mayor Aldrich's wife Margaret, who said simply, and with great feeling, that he was the sort of man the territory needed more of. Julia listened to all of this with genuine courtesy, and an internal observation that the town of Caldwell Creek had constructed something close to a legend out of a living man, which was a thing she found somewhat unfair to the man in question. Legends had a way of replacing the actual person they were built around. She had no opinion about Jacob Garrison as a man because she had not spoken to him. She had a mild opinion about the phenomenon of his fame in a small town, which was that it was worth being careful around. She was also, genuinely, too busy. The schoolhouse windows arrived from Santa Fe on a Tuesday, and the question of who would help install them became a small community event. Julia had assumed Benny Walsh and his son Tom would manage it, but Tom had sprained his wrist falling from a ladder the previous day, and Benny, though willing, was 60 years old and working more slowly than the season allowed. Mayor Aldrich arrived at the schoolhouse that morning looking slightly flustered, and said he had found someone to help. Julia was on her knees painting the baseboards of the schoolhouse interior, a task she had taken on herself because it needed doing, when she heard boots on the raw wood floor behind her. She did not look up immediately. She finished the stroke she was making with the brush, set the brush across the top of the paint can with care, and then stood and turned. Jacob Garrison was standing in the doorway of the schoolhouse. He was taller than she had registered from a distance, and he was looking at her with an expression that was quiet and genuinely curious, not the particular kind of curious that men sometimes aimed at women, which she recognized and found tiresome, but a different kind, the kind that was simply paying attention. "Miss Dawson," he said, "I'm Jacob Garrison. The mayor asked me to come help with the windows." "Thank you for coming, Mr. Garrison," Julia said. "Do you know anything about installing window frames?" He looked at her for a moment as though the question had surprised him pleasantly. "Yes," he said, "a fair amount." "Good," she said, and picked her paintbrush back up. "Old Benny Walsh is outside with the frames. He'll show you where they go, and I'd appreciate your taking his advice on the technique since he knows the building. I need these baseboards finished by this afternoon because the desks are arriving tomorrow and I cannot have wet paint under them." Jacob Garrison looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am," with something in his voice that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, and went outside. They worked through the morning in their separate tasks, Julia inside and Jacob outside with Benny Walsh, and the work went well. Around midday, Margaret Aldrich arrived with a basket of food for everyone working, the sort of thoughtful gesture that was simply who Margaret Aldrich was, and they all ate together in the shade on the east side of the building. Julia sat on a sawhorse with a tin cup of water and ate a biscuit with ham, and listened to Benny Walsh talk about the building's construction, which he was proud of and rightfully so. Jacob sat on the ground with his back against the schoolhouse wall and ate without much comment and listened to Benny as well. Julia was aware, with the peripheral awareness that good teachers develop for what is happening at the edge of their sight, that Jacob Garrison was not watching her the way other people in Caldwell Creek watched her. The others watched her with the particular attention of people who were still categorizing her, deciding where she fit in their understanding of things. Jacob seemed simply present. When he did glance at her directly, it was to pass the water jug or to ask whether the paint smell inside was giving her a headache, a practical question she appreciated. "It's fine," she said. "Are the windows going well?" "Two done, two to go," he said. "Benny's good at this. He just needed someone to hold the frame steady while he sets the screws." "I should have thought of that," Julia said, meaning the problem of needing two people for the steadying. "You're painting baseboards and ordering textbooks and meeting 40 families," Jacob said. "You can't think of everything." It was a simple, matter-of-fact thing to say. Julia looked at him and found that he had already looked away, back toward Benny Walsh's story about the lumber that had been sourced from the mill in Raton. She drank her water and thought, briefly, and without much weight, that the most talked-about man in the territory was considerably more straightforward than his reputation had suggested. Then she went back inside and finished the baseboards. The windows were done by 3 in the afternoon. Jacob and Benny Walsh between them had set all 4 frames cleanly, and the glass sat true in each one, the afternoon light coming through at a low September angle and laying warm bars across the freshly painted floor. Julia stood in the doorway and looked at it. The schoolhouse looked like a schoolhouse now. It looked like something real. She was aware of Jacob Garrison standing slightly behind her and to the left, also looking at it. After a moment she said, "It looks very good, thank you." "Benny did the hard part," Jacob said. "You held the frames," she said. "That matters." There was a short silence. Then he said, "Will you be ready to open on time?" 2 weeks from Monday," she said. "I intend to be." He nodded as though this answer was exactly what he expected, turned to get his hat from the fence post where he had hung it and said, "Good luck with it, Miss Dawson." He settled the hat on his head and walked back toward the main street of town. She watched him go, or she saw him go in her peripheral vision, while she was already thinking about the placement of the desks tomorrow, which amounted to the same thing. Mabel Prout came to the dry goods store the following morning with a look of breathless significance on her face. "I heard Jacob Garrison helped with your schoolhouse windows," she said. "He did," Julia said. "He and Benny Walsh both. It was generous of them." "Did you speak with him much?" "Enough to coordinate the work," Julia said. "I need 12 feet of sturdy rope, Mabel, for hanging the map boards." Mabel looked slightly disappointed that there was not more to report, but she measured out the rope. The schoolhouse opened on a Monday in early October. 22 children arranged behind the new wooden desks in the clean morning light coming through the 4 windows, and Julia Dawson began to teach. She had 31 students enrolled, though only 22 appeared the first day. The others kept home for various reasons that ranged from harvest work to suspicion of formal education. She expected most of them by the end of the first week, and she was right. By the following Monday, 29 were present. The work absorbed her completely, as teaching always had. She was good at it in the way some people are built for a particular thing, her patience exactly calibrated, her instinct for which child needed encouragement and which needed challenge finely tuned. The parents noticed. The children, which was harder, also noticed. Word went through Caldwell Creek, as it always did, that Miss Julia Dawson was something special, which she found embarrassing and which she managed by simply continuing to work. Jacob Garrison sent her a crate of firewood the week after the school opened, via Tom Walsh, who had recovered his wrist and was glad to have something useful to do. There was a note tucked into the top of the crate, written in a clear, unhurried hand. "Miss Dawson. The mornings will get cold soon and the schoolhouse stove needs good dry wood to draw properly. This should last you 2 weeks. If it doesn't, let Mrs. Callahan know and I'll arrange more. Garrison. Julia read the note twice. It was a practical note. It was the note of a man who had noticed that the schoolhouse might get cold and done something about it without being asked. She wrote back, also through Tom Walsh, who was delighted to be involved. Mr. Garrison, thank you for the firewood. It was thoughtful and very welcome. I have noted that the stove draws well when the damper is fully open in the first 15 minutes and then eased back. If you have any guidance from your experience with similar stoves, I would be glad to hear it. Dawson. She added the practical question, not as a pretext for further communication, but because she genuinely wanted to know about the stove. Tom Walsh delivered the note. Tom Walsh returned the following afternoon with a response. Miss Dawson, yes, you have it right about the damper. One thing, the stove in a building like yours will lose heat through the floor in December if there's no insulation under it. Laying a strip of tin underneath extends the radiant heat considerably. Hector Vega at the blacksmith shop can cut you a piece. Tell him I mentioned it. Garrison. Julia went to Hector Vega's blacksmith shop that afternoon. Hector Vega was a large, cheerful man of perhaps 50, who had been in Caldwell Creek longer than almost anyone, and who received her with great enthusiasm. He cut her the tin strip while she watched, talking the whole time about his grandchildren who were enrolled in her school and who had come home speaking of fractions with something that he described as very close to excitement. Jacob told you to come, Hector said, fitting the tin carefully at its edges. He mentioned it might help, Julia said. Hector beamed. That is Jacob. He sees a thing that needs doing and he mentions it. He never makes a performance of it. He looked at her with a particular expression that Julia recognized as the expression of someone who was about to say something pointed and had decided to go ahead. You know, in 11 months he has not paid particular attention to any woman in this town. He is polite and kind to everyone, but it is different from particular attention. The note about the firewood, that is the first time he has done something like that. He sent firewood to a schoolhouse, Julia said. That is a charitable gesture, not a particular one. Hector made a sound that was not quite agreement. Julia thanked him for the tin and carried it back to the schoolhouse herself. She thought about what Hector had said more than she intended to, which she found mildly irritating. She was not in Caldwell Creek to be the subject of any man's particular attention. She was here to teach 31 children to read and reason and understand the world they were growing up in. She had a purpose, and it was a good one, and it did not depend on Jacob Garrison or anyone else. But October became November, and November had a way of making things different. The first snow came on a Wednesday, light and early, dusting the red rock ridges white and turning the main street of Caldwell Creek into something both beautiful and treacherous. Julia arrived at the schoolhouse that morning to find that the stove had gone cold in the night, the damper having slipped, and the room was barely above freezing. She worked the stove back up with careful, patient work. The tin strip Hector had cut for her radiating warmth upward once the fire caught properly, and by the time her students arrived the room was warm enough. But it had taken 40 minutes she had not planned for, and she stood at the window for a moment looking at the snow-dusted town with a feeling she recognized and did not particularly enjoy, which was the feeling of being alone with a difficulty. She managed it. She always managed. But the feeling had been there. Jacob Garrison appeared at her schoolhouse door that afternoon after the children had gone home, with a second damper mechanism wrapped in canvas under his arm. This one locks in position, he said. Tom Walsh and I rigged it this morning after he told me you'd had trouble. It won't slip in the night. Julia looked at him standing in the doorway of her schoolhouse with snow on the shoulders of his jacket and a damper mechanism under his arm, and felt something move in her chest that she examined carefully and honestly. It was gratitude, certainly. It was also the recognition of something she had not expected, which was that Jacob Garrison was simply, fundamentally, a man who paid attention to what needed paying attention to and then did the paying attention quietly and without fanfare, and that this quality which she had admired abstractly in people was in practice rather devastating. "Come in," she said. "It's cold." He came in and installed the new damper with a few economical movements, testing it twice, and then stood and looked at the schoolhouse with the same quiet attention he gave to everything. The walls now had the children's first writing samples tacked to them. The map board hung on its rope hooks. The desks were arranged in 3 rows angled slightly toward the stove for winter. "You've made it a good room," he said. "The children made it one," she said. "I just arranged the furniture." He looked at her with something that was very close to a smile. "That's not how I heard it." "How did you hear it?" Tom Walsh's youngest, Lucy, told him that Miss Dawson taught her that numbers are a language and that she could learn any language if she worked at it. He paused. "Tom told me she's been practicing her sums at the dinner table every night since." Julia was quiet for a moment. "That is very good to hear." "It is," he said simply, and picked up the canvas the damper had been wrapped in. He folded it with the precise, habitual care of someone who has lived out of doors long enough to be automatic about taking care of equipment. Julia watched this small, unconscious gesture and felt the thing in her chest move again, more definitively. "Mr. Garrison," she said, before she had entirely decided to speak, "I have never properly thanked you for everything you have done for the school since it opened. The firewood, the stove advice, and now this. It has been considerable." "It's a school," he said, as though this explained it entirely, which in some ways it did. He looked at her directly, which he did not do often, and when he did it was not the look of a man performing interest but of a man who had arrived somewhere honestly. "A town without a school is only half a town. You came here to fix that. It seemed like helping was the right thing to do." "Most people who feel that way send money to the building fund," Julia said, and there was a warmth in her voice that she had not planned. He considered this. "I'm not very good at sending money," he said. "I'm better at dampers," Julia laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polite variety, and it surprised them both slightly. Jacob's expression shifted into something open that she had not seen there before. He was, she thought in that moment, genuinely handsome when he was open rather than simply present, though she noted this the way she noted the angle of afternoon light in the schoolhouse, as a fact worth knowing. "Will you have supper?" she asked. "I have a pot of beans on the small stove in my room, and there is enough for 2. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he would say no, and had already begun to prepare a graceful response for that. Then he said, "I would like that, Miss Dawson. Thank you." They ate beans and cornbread in the small room behind the schoolhouse that served as Julia's living quarters, sitting across from each other at the little table, and the conversation that happened was one of those conversations that neither party expects to be the kind they will think about for a long time afterward. Jacob told her about the territory, the real geography of it, the things that maps could not show, the way the light changed in the canyon country to the north, the way the Rio Grande smelled in spring when the snowmelt came off the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. He talked about cattle, not the romance of it but the actual physical work, the problem-solving of moving large animals through difficult terrain, the relationship between a rider and a horse that was built over months of consistent work. Julia told him about Albuquerque, about her mother who had been a schoolteacher herself and her father who had been a surveyor, and had died of a fever when she was 15, about the public library in Albuquerque where she had spent most of her adolescence reading everything available, about her conviction that the territories needed schools, and that the territories needed them now, not after they achieved statehood but now, while the children were young and the opportunity was present. "You sound very certain about what's needed," Jacob said. It was not a challenge. It was an observation made with interest. "I am," Julia said. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said, and met her eyes across the table. "It's rare. People are mostly certain about very small things. You're certain about something that matters." The snow outside had settled into the darkness, and the stove made its small, regular sounds. The lamplight was warm on the table between them. Julia felt very clearly, with the clarity that she recognized as genuine and therefore important, that she was sitting across from a man she wanted to continue knowing. After supper, Jacob helped her clear the dishes, which she had not asked him to do, and said good night at the door with his hat in his hands. He said it simply, without the particular weight of a man who is trying to communicate something beyond what he is saying, and she found this right somehow, the correct tempo for where they were. She watched him walk up the dark street toward the rooming house and stood in the cold for just a moment before going in, because the cold felt clarifying. November deepened. Jacob Garrison came to help with the schoolhouse intermittently, whenever there was something specific to do, and sometimes there was something specific to do, and sometimes there was not, and he came anyway, in the late afternoons, and they talked. The conversations ranged across everything. Julia was astonished to discover the range of his reading, achieved not through formal education, but through the careful pursuit of books wherever he could find them. He had strong opinions about practical philosophy, about the management of land and water rights, about the right way to treat a horse and the wrong way, and about justice, the last of which he spoke about with a quiet seriousness that told her it was something he had thought about for a long time. He told her, one evening in mid-November, about a thing he had witnessed when he was 19, working cattle in the lower territory. A Mescalero Apache family had been removed from land they had been farming for 3 generations, legally by the letter of a treaty that was itself a forced agreement, wrong in the deeper sense that was harder to put words to, but that Jacob had no trouble naming. He had watched it happen. He had been young enough that he had not known what to do about it and old enough to know he should have done something. The weight of it was still with him. He described it not dramatically, but with the quiet precision of a man who has carried something a long time and knows its exact dimensions. Julia listened carefully. She had her own experiences with injustice, smaller in scale but sharp in memory, of being told in Albuquerque that the school board was uncertain, a woman could manage the discipline of older students, of watching her father's surveying partner receive twice the credit for shared work, because her father was a Mexican-American man in a territory that had very particular ideas about credit and who deserved it. She told Jacob these things without self-pity because they were simply true, and she watched him listen to them with the same attention he gave everything, no performance of outrage, just real hearing. "Your father sounds like a good man," he said. "He was," she said. "He taught me that the world was larger than what people said it was. He was right, but the saying of it takes effort sometimes." "Yes," Jacob said, "it does." They sat quietly for a moment. Outside, the November wind moved around the corners of the schoolhouse building with a low, persistent voice. "Mr. Garrison," Julia said, because something had been sitting with her for several weeks, and she was not a person who left things sitting unexamined for longer than necessary. "The whole town of Caldwell Creek talks about you constantly. You must be aware of it." He looked at the table for a moment. "Yes," he said. "Does it trouble you?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was constructing an answer, but when he spoke it was simple. "It used to. Now I've mostly decided it's the town's business and mine is my own." "That's a sensible position," she said, "though I imagine it gets lonely sometimes, being inside a story that other people are telling." He looked at her then with an expression she had not seen from him before, something that was both unguarded and, she thought, slightly surprised, as though she had located something precisely that he had not expected to be located. "Yes," he said quietly, "it does." "Well," Julia said, with a warmth she did not try to moderate, "I have been in Caldwell Creek for almost 2 months, and this is the longest conversation I have had with you, and I have not told anyone about it, and I do not intend to. So I think that is your business and mine equally." He looked at her for a long moment, and then something shifted in his face into what she was almost certain was the full and genuine version of the smile she had only seen approach before, and it was, as she had suspected it might be, rather wonderful. I think you might be the only person in the territory who hasn't asked me a single question about my reputation, he said. You're more interesting than your reputation, Julia said. He was quiet for a moment. That's a kind thing to say. It isn't kind, she said with honest directness. It's simply accurate. December arrived with the full weight of a New Mexico winter, the sky going the particular color of iron in the mornings, the wind in the canyons carrying sound from miles away. Julia kept the schoolhouse warm and her students attending through the early weeks of it, adjusting the curriculum for the shortened daylight hours and the restlessness that cold weather brought to children who were ordinarily kept outdoors. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography, and a unit on natural history that she assembled from a combination of her own knowledge, and 3 reference books she had managed to borrow from the public reading room in Santa Fe through a correspondence with its librarian. Jacob had told her about the lending arrangement with the Santa Fe librarian 2 weeks before it occurred to her to try it, which she appreciated, but did not tell him because she suspected he would find it unnecessary to be thanked for advice, and she did not want to embarrass him. They had settled by December into a pattern of seeing each other 2 or 3 times a week that had the quality of something organic rather than planned. He appeared at the schoolhouse sometimes to bring wood or to fix something that needed fixing, and sometimes simply to talk. She went twice to Mrs. Callahan's rooming house porch, once to return a book he had lent her, and once because she had been walking past on her way to the general store, and he had been reading there, and she had simply stopped. These visits felt natural to her in the way that only right things feel natural, as though they required no effort beyond the effort of honesty. Mabel Prout had opinions about this development that she shared with every person in Caldwell Creek except Julia, who heard about them secondhand through Margaret Aldrich, who told her with a slightly apologetic expression that people were talking. Julia received this information with composure. "Let them," she said. "They were talking before and they'll talk after. It's what towns do." Margaret Aldrich looked at her with something like admiration. "Are you fond of him?" Julia considered being indirect and decided against it, because Margaret was both kind and smart and would see through it. "I'm becoming so, yes," she said. "I am being careful about it because I am serious about it." Margaret reached across and pressed her hand briefly. "He is serious too," she said. "Anyone who looks can see it." Julia thought about that on her walk back to the schoolhouse, the cold air pulling at the edges of her coat. She thought that being serious was right and necessary. She thought that the thing she felt when Jacob Garrison walked into a room and her peripheral awareness of everything sharpened to include him specifically was not a small thing. She thought about the way he had looked at her when she said he was more interesting than his reputation, and how completely unguarded that look had been. She decided that she was going to stop being careful in the sense of holding back and simply be honest with herself about what she wanted, which was to continue knowing him, and to let the knowing go wherever it went. The Christmas dance at Caldwell Creek was held in the Grange Hall on the 23rd of December, a tradition that the town took seriously, with bunting and lanterns and a fiddle player named Amos Keene, who was genuinely gifted, and who also played harmonica when the fiddling needed a rest. The whole town came. Julia wore her best dress, which was a deep green wool that she had sewn herself over several evenings, and she arrived with the Aldriches and was immediately absorbed into the warm, lamp-bright crowd of Caldwell Creek at its most sociable. She danced with Mayor Aldrich, who was surprisingly light on his feet for a round man. She danced with Benny Walsh, who was not light on his feet but was enthusiastic. She danced with Hector Vega, who was excellent and who winked at her when he said, "Jacob is watching the door." "Is he here?" Julia asked because she had not seen him. "He arrived 10 minutes ago," Hector said. "He almost never comes to these things." The last one he attended was the spring fair, and he stayed 40 minutes. Julia did not look toward the door, which required a moderate amount of discipline, and she finished the dance with Hector and then accepted a cup of punch from Mrs. Stokes, the Reverend's wife, and engaged her in a conversation about the children's Christmas pageant that the school was preparing, which was a genuine conversation because the pageant was genuinely something Julia was pleased with, her students having applied themselves to it with remarkable seriousness. Jacob found her at the punch table. He appeared beside her with the unobtrusive quality he had of arriving without making an entrance, and he was wearing a clean dark jacket over his shirt, no tie but his collar was correct, and his hat was in his hand. He looked, she thought, like himself but with slightly more formal intentions. "Miss Dawson," he said, "you look very well." "Thank you, Mr. Garrison," she said. "So do you. I understand you rarely attend these events." "I don't generally find them comfortable," he said. "Too many people with too many things to say. And yet you came," she said. He looked at her directly, with the full honesty of expression that she had come to recognize as his actual face when he was not managing a public situation. "Yes," he said, "I did." There was a moment between them in which the fiddle music and the conversation and the warmth of the crowded hall all continued to exist but receded slightly in importance. "Would you like to dance?" Julia asked, because she was not a person who waited when a thing was clear. He smiled, the full one. "I was working up to asking," he said. "Yes." They danced twice, which was one dance more than was strictly conventional for two people who had not yet declared themselves. And the town of Caldwell Creek noticed, naturally, because the town of Caldwell Creek noticed everything. But what they noticed primarily was that Jacob Garrison, who danced like a man who had learned in rooms larger than this one, danced with Miss Dawson as though the room had become exactly the right size, and that Miss Dawson, who danced with the posture of a woman who was accustomed to being competent at whatever she turned her attention to, danced with him as though she had been doing it for years. Between the two dances, they stood near the wall for a few minutes, and he told her that he had ridden out toward the North Canyons that afternoon before the dance, and the ice had formed on the creek, and the light had come through it at a low angle, and the whole canyon had been briefly pink. He told her this simply, as something he had seen and wanted to describe, and she listened to him describe it, and felt with great clarity that she was in love with him. She did not say this at the Christmas dance. It was not the right moment for saying it, and she was a person who was precise about moments, but she held the knowledge carefully and with some wonder. The school pageant was on Christmas Eve, 29 children in their best clothes performing in the freshly decorated schoolhouse with every parent and most of the town in attendance, crowded standing at the back when the chairs ran out. The children were extraordinary, which was the right word because Julia had approached the pageant as she approached everything, as a genuine opportunity to show the children what they were capable of, and they had risen to it. Tom Walsh's youngest, Lucy, read a passage from the Gospel in a clear, steady voice. 3 of the older boys performed a short play about the first surveyors of the territory that Julia had written herself, incorporating real history, which made the older men in the audience sit up slightly straighter with recognition. The younger children sang together with a purity of sound that produced tears in several of the mothers and in old Benny Walsh, who turned his face away briefly and then turned back and did not pretend he hadn't. Jacob Garrison was standing at the back of the schoolhouse. Julia did not look at him during the pageant except once, near the end, and he was watching the children with an expression that was unguarded and moved. She looked away again before he noticed and felt her heart do something simple and involuntary and good. After the pageant, when the children had gone home with their families and the town had mostly filtered out into the cold Christmas Eve night, Julia was tidying the schoolhouse, stacking chairs and blowing out the extra lamps, and Jacob was still there. He had stayed without asking whether she needed help, which she appreciated because she did need help, and because asking first would have made it feel like an offer rather than a simple decision. "It was a beautiful thing," he said, handing her a chair to stack. "What you did with those children." "What they did," Julia said automatically. "What you did," he said, with a firmness that was mild but clear. "You built something here that didn't exist before you came. That is yours, Miss Dawson. Take credit for it." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the direct honesty that she had become entirely unable to be unaffected by. "Julia," she said, "I think it's time you called me Julia." Something in his expression shifted the way something shifts when a door opens. "Julia," he said. It was simply her name. It was, from him, a great deal more than simply her name. "And I would like to call you Jacob," she said. "Yes," he said, "please." They finished tidying the schoolhouse, and he walked her back to her room at the back of the building through the cold Christmas Eve. The stars over the territory spread out above them with the extraordinary particular brightness of high-altitude winter sky. At her door he stopped, and so did she, and they stood in the cold and looked at each other in the starlight. "Jacob," she said, "I want to tell you something directly because I find that I am not capable of being indirect about things that matter to me." "I know that about you," he said. "I consider it one of your finest qualities." "I am in love with you," she said. "I have been for some weeks. I thought you should know." He was quiet for a moment, not a surprised quiet but a considered one, the quiet of a man arriving at something he has been approaching for a long time. Then he said, "Julia, I have been trying to find the right way to tell you the same thing for the better part of 2 months." He paused. "I should have just told you." "Yes," she said and smiled. "You should have." He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had touched her, and his hand was warm despite the cold night, and she felt the warmth of it go up her arm and settle somewhere central and permanent. He lifted her hand and held it for a moment, looking at it, and then looked at her. "May I call on you properly?" asked. "Take you to supper or for a ride out to the canyons, properly." "You have been calling on me properly for 2 months, Jacob," she said. "You've just been doing it under the pretense of damper mechanisms and firewood." He laughed genuinely, the kind of laugh that was surprised out of him, and the sound of it in the cold Christmas Eve air was a sound she wanted to hear for the rest of her life, which she recognized immediately as a very large and certain thought. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I have." He squeezed her hand gently and released it. "Good night, Julia. Merry Christmas." "Merry Christmas, Jacob," she said. She watched him walk up the dark street toward the green door of Mrs. Callahan's rooming house. She stood in the cold for a long moment, looking at the stars. January was the month when Caldwell Creek turned inward, the cold making it a town of lamplit rooms and close fireside conversations. And for Julia and Jacob, it was the month in which the thing between them became undeniable and simply real. He took her to supper at the hotel dining room on a Saturday, and they talked for 3 hours while the other diners came and went around them. The conversation ranging from cattle management to political philosophy to the particular quality of silence in the canyon country, which he wanted her to see, and which she intended to. He brought her a book he had found at the general store, a volume of natural history he had traded 3 months of evening labor for, carrying crates and managing stock for the Greenfield Trading Company. She did not know this until Mabel Prout mentioned it, and when she brought it up to Jacob, he looked slightly uncomfortable in the way of someone whose private generosity has been reported without their consent. "You worked 3 months for that book," she said. "I didn't need the money particularly," he said. "The trading company needed the work done." "Jacob, it's a good book," he said. She reached across the small table at the hotel dining room and put her hand over his, which silenced him in the best possible way. "It is a wonderful book," she said, "and you are wonderful, and I wish you would let me say so sometimes without looking as though I've embarrassed you." He turned his hand over and held hers. "I'm working on it," he said, and the honesty of the acknowledgement was, she thought, the most wonderful thing of all. They rode out to the North Canyons on a Sunday in February, bundled against the cold on Jacob's black horse, whose name was Ezra, and a reliable bay mare Julia borrowed from the livery. The ride took 2 hours through country that changed gradually from the scrub and dust of the valley floor to a landscape of red sandstone walls rising above them, the creek frozen in its bed, the silence total and specific in the way Jacob had described it. They stopped in a wide bend where the canyon walls caught the midday sun and the rock was warm despite the cold air. The horses stood quietly, Jacob stood beside Ezra with his hand on the horse's neck, looking up at the red walls, and Julia stood beside him and looked up with him. "I see it," she said. "Which part?" "All of it, the particular bigness of it, and the silence having an actual texture." He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." She reached for his hand without looking away from the canyon walls, and he took it. And they stood like that for a long while, which was the right way to be in a place like that. On the ride back, when the canyon had opened again into the valley and the town of Caldwell Creek was visible as a collection of rooftops at the edge of the afternoon light, Jacob said, "Julia, I need to tell you something about where I came from. I've been working up to it for a while." "Then tell me," she said. He was quiet for a moment, the horses walking at an easy pace. "I had a brother," he said, "named Daniel. He was 22 when he died. He got tangled up with men he shouldn't have gotten tangled with, in a scheme that was dishonest, and I tried to get him out of it and failed. He died in a gunfight that he started and didn't finish." He paused. "That is what I came to New Mexico to get away from. Not from the law, I want to be clear about that. I did nothing illegal, but from the weight of it, from the fact of failing him." Julia listened to all of this without speaking. When he finished, she said, "How long ago?" "4 years," he said, "and you still carry it." "You carry these things always," he said. "You learn to carry them better is the most you can say." "Yes," she said softly, "you do." She thought of her father, of the particular ongoing grief that was not sharp anymore but was always present, the shape of it familiar as a stone she had been holding for years. "Thank you for telling me. I didn't want you to build an understanding of me that had a gap in it," he said. "I wouldn't," she said, "but I'm glad you told me anyway." They rode into town in the late afternoon with the sky going gold above the western ridges, and the sight of them riding together on the main street of Caldwell Creek was observed by at least 12 people and discussed thoroughly by all 12 of them before supper. Julia was aware, without caring much, that the town had shifted its talk from Jacob Garrison the legend to Jacob Garrison and Julia Dawson the story, which was a more interesting talk and a more honest one. What they told each other was essentially true. That Miss Dawson, who had arrived in September too busy to look up from her work, and Jacob Garrison, who had been in the territory for a year being looked at by everyone without being seen by anyone, had found each other in the way that sometimes happens in small places, through proximity and necessity and the gradual revelations of winter. What they could not tell each other, because they had not seen it and Julia and Jacob had not said it aloud to anyone, was what it felt like from the inside, which was like finding a country you had heard described in terms that were inadequate, and then arriving there and finding the inadequacy was in the describing, not in the country itself. Spring arrived in Caldwell Creek with the particular violence of high desert springs, warm days breaking cold nights, wildflowers appearing in the arroyos with a suddenness that was startling every year no matter how many times you had seen it. The school had been in session 5 months, and the results were visible and real. Children who had arrived unable to read were reading. Children who had been afraid of arithmetic were showing off their calculation abilities in the general store, which delighted Mabel Prout and occasionally complicated her accounting. The town felt different to itself in some small but genuine way, the way that towns feel when something good has been added that was missing. Mayor Aldrich came to Julia in March with a proposal from the school board to increase her contract and add a second teaching position, which she had been advocating for since October, as the enrollment was now at 35 and growing. She accepted the contract increase and wrote immediately to the superintendent in Santa Fe, recommending a young woman named Clara Pierce she had met at a teachers' conference in Albuquerque the previous year, who was exactly the right kind of serious. Jacob had extended his work with the Harker brothers' cattle operation into a more formal arrangement. He was not quite a partner but something close to it, managing the spring cattle drive and overseeing the management of the eastern range. He was building something, Julia recognized, in the same way she was building something, steadily and with intention. They talked about this one evening in April, sitting on the steps of the schoolhouse in the first genuinely warm evening of spring, the air smelling of new growth and distant water. They talked about the future in the way that people talk about it when they are both invested in the same general direction and are being honest enough to acknowledge this. "I'm going to have enough money by autumn to buy the Hendricks property north of town," Jacob said. 40 acres with good water. "I've been thinking about it for 6 months." He paused. "I'd like to build something there, a real house." Julia was quiet for a moment, looking at the darkening sky above the eastern ridge. "A house is a serious undertaking," she said. "Yes," he said. He was looking at her, she knew, though she was looking at the sky. "I am serious." She turned and looked at him. In the spring evening his face was clear and open, no performance, no management, just the honest face of a man who was saying exactly what he meant. She loved him with a totality that she had not honestly expected when she arrived in Caldwell Creek with her trunks and her carpet bag, focused entirely on 31 children and a building with no windows. "Jacob," she said, "are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm working up to it," he said. She smiled. "Well," she said, "keep working." He laughed, and then he was serious again, and he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a ring, a simple band of silver set with a small turquoise stone that was the color of the sky in October. He held it in his palm and looked at it and then looked at her. "I bought this in October," he said. She stared at him. "October." "I knew in October," he said. "Or I knew before October, but October was when I was certain enough to buy a ring." He met her eyes. "Julia Dawson, I would like to spend the rest of my life being the person you know most honestly, and I would like to build that house with you on the Hendricks property, and I would like to be your husband if you will have me. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the ring in his palm and at his face and at the darkening sky and at the schoolhouse behind her with its 4 glass windows that now showed lamp reflections in the dusk. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He put the ring on her finger and it fit as though it had been made for her specifically, which it had been. He had taken her measurements from a thimble he had borrowed from Mrs. Callahan on a pretext that he had not entirely worked out, and Mrs. Callahan had immediately given him the thimble and also cried somewhat, which he had not anticipated. He kissed her then, which was the first time, and she kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable, and the spring evening continued around them with the warmth and the wildflower smell, and the sound of the town of Caldwell Creek going about its evening business in the particular direction of ordinary happiness. The news of the engagement reached every household in Caldwell Creek by the following morning, and the response was the kind of universal, uncomplicated delight that small towns are genuinely capable of when something is obviously right. Mabel Prout cried. Hector Vega shook Jacob's hand for approximately 45 seconds, and then embraced him briefly and vigorously. Margaret Aldrich brought Julia flowers she had cut from her own garden. The Harker brothers, who were not sentimental men, showed up at the schoolhouse after hours to congratulate Julia, and ended up staying for an hour discussing the spring cattle drive and the property north of town, which was apparently also something they found very good news. Old Benny Walsh made a speech at the general store that Tuesday morning that nobody had asked for but that everyone listened to anyway, about how a town was its people, and its people were most themselves when they recognized good things and celebrated them, which was not a complex speech but was delivered with conviction and received with warmth. The wedding was set for June, which gave them 2 months, and the 2 months were full and good and passed in the way that genuinely happy periods pass, not quickly exactly but without waste. Julia prepared for the end of the school year and the beginning of the next, which would include Clara Pierce's arrival from Albuquerque. Jacob completed the arrangements for the Hendricks property and began the house in May, which the Harker brothers and several other men helped with on Saturdays in the way of frontier communities, the work collective and social and serious. Julia went to the building site most Saturday afternoons, bringing food and water, and eventually bringing her measuring eye to the interior layout, which Jacob invited with a seriousness that meant she was genuinely making decisions and not being accommodated. They argued productively about the placement of the kitchen hearth and about the number of windows, Julia wanting more than Jacob's initial plan had included, and he conceded because she was right and also because watching her be certain about things she knew better than him was something he found entirely compelling and did not want to discourage. The house was far enough along by the first week of June to be clearly what it was going to be, the walls up and the roof framing begun, the kitchen hearth in its correct position with Julia's larger south-facing window beside it. It was a good house. It was going to be a real home. They were married on the 14th of June, 1884, in Reverend Stokes Church at the end of Caldwell Creek's Main Street, with the whole town in attendance, and Amos Keene playing his fiddle at the door as they came out into the summer morning. Julia wore a dress that she and Margaret Aldrich had made together over several evenings, ivory lawn with blue ribbon at the cuffs, and she carried a small bunch of wildflowers that she had gathered herself from the arroyos that morning, because she wanted them to be genuinely wild and not arranged. Jacob wore his best dark jacket and a tie that he had spent considerable private effort learning to knot correctly, and he was as handsome as anyone in Caldwell Creek had ever seen him, which was a fact reported widely and accurately. At the moment Julia appeared in the church doorway, about to come down the aisle on Mayor Aldrich's arm because she had no father to walk with her, and the mayor had offered with such genuine feeling that she had accepted, Jacob turned and looked at her from the front of the church. The look on his face was one that several people present described afterward, all in different words that amounted to the same thing. A man arriving somewhere he had been trying to get to for a long time, looking at it with complete and uncomplicated recognition. Julia walked down the aisle toward him and felt exactly as she expected to feel, which was certain and glad and aware of everything around her with the clarity of a moment that would be carried forward. She reached him and he took her hand and they stood together in front of Reverend Stokes and made promises that were simple and meant entirely. After, on the church steps in the summer morning, Hector Vega kissed her on the cheek and told her she was the best thing that had happened to Jacob Garrison, and that Jacob Garrison was the best thing that had happened to Caldwell Creek, which she suspected was the highest compliment available in that territory. Jacob shook hands and accepted the embraces of half the town with a warmth she had not seen him show in public before, as though the occasion had opened something that had been managed closed, and she watched him be happy with the open happiness of someone who no longer needed to be careful about it. They stayed at the hotel that night, the best room, which Margaret Aldrich had arranged as a wedding gift, and in the morning they rode out together toward the North Canyons because Jacob wanted to show her the canyon in summer, which was different from winter, the creek running full and clear, the canyon walls going gold in the morning light rather than pink in the winter afternoon. It was different. It was also, as she told him, even better. The house was finished by August of 1884, a real house of 4 rooms with a porch that faced south and caught the afternoon light, a kitchen garden that Julia planted immediately with more ambition than the remaining summer would technically support, and 3 windows on the south wall that made the main room bright and warm in all seasons. They moved in on a Thursday, carrying Julia's trunks and Jacob's very few possessions, which included his books, his gear, and a framed photograph of his brother Daniel that he placed on the mantelpiece of the kitchen hearth, and that Julia did not ask him about but saw him look at sometimes in the evenings when he thought she was reading. She asked him one evening in October, their first autumn in the house, to tell her about Daniel, really tell her. He sat with his coffee cup in both hands for a moment, and then he did all of it, the good parts and the bad parts and the parts that were neither just true. He talked for an hour and she listened for all of it, and at the end she said, "He sounds like someone who was lost and looking for solid ground." "Yes," Jacob said, "he was. You tried to be his solid ground, she said. That is not the same as failing him. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. I know that now, he said, most of the time. She reached over and put her hand on his arm, and the photograph stayed on the mantelpiece because it belonged there. Daniel Garrison present in the house as a fact of Jacob's life, and therefore of their shared one, which was the right and honest way to hold him. The autumn of 1884 was good in Caldwell Creek. The cattle drives had gone well. Jacob's relationship with the Harker brothers had deepened into something that was genuinely a partnership. The school was thriving with 2 teachers and an enrollment of 41. And the town had the feeling of itself that happy towns have, of things working. Clara Pierce arrived in September and proved to be exactly as Julia had expected, serious and capable and good with children, with a particular gift for the youngest students. Julia and Clara established a working relationship that was collegial and honest and mutually respectful, which Julia had hoped for but found was even better in practice than in hope. In November of that year, Julia told Jacob that she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast on a Wednesday, simply and directly, because that was how she told things. He looked up from his coffee cup and was very still for a moment, and then his face did the thing it had done at the church when she had walked down the aisle toward him, the complete and uncomplicated recognition, and he stood up and came around the table and held her, carefully and with tremendous feeling. "Jacob," she said from within his arms. "I'm here," he said. "I'm right here." "I know," she said. "I know you are." The spring of 1885 arrived with its usual force, and the baby arrived in April. A boy, born on a clear morning with the canyon wind bringing the smell of new growth through the south windows that Julia had insisted on, delivered by Dr. Patterson with Jacob present and steady throughout in the way she had known he would be. The boy was healthy and entirely himself from the first minute, a quality that Jacob recognized with a kind of awed wonder. They named him Thomas Daniel Garrison, Thomas for no reason except that it sat right in Daniel for Jacob's brother, which Julia had suggested, and which Jacob had received with an expression that was full and wordless, and that she would remember her whole life. Thomas Daniel Garrison was brought to Caldwell Creek's Main Street 2 weeks after his birth in his mother's arms, and the town of Caldwell Creek received him with the particular enthusiasm of a place that has watched a love story from its beginning, and is very pleased with how the story is going. Mabel Prout held him and declared him perfect. Hector Vega held him with practiced ease and told him in Spanish that he had excellent parents. Mayor Aldrich shook Jacob's hand firmly and told him that the territory needed more good men and that he was already off to an excellent start. Old Benny Walsh looked at the baby from a respectful distance and said nothing, which was more feeling than a speech would have carried. Julia returned to teaching in August, bringing Thomas to the schoolhouse in the early mornings while Clara Pierce prepared the afternoon sessions. The arrangement was unconventional, and she was aware of this, and she did not particularly care, because what she cared about was her students and her son, and the structure of a life that held them all, and she had built that structure carefully and it held. Jacob with the Harker brothers completed a cattle drive in September that was significant enough in scale to be reported in the Santa Fe paper, which Julia read aloud to him in the kitchen on an evening in late September, while Thomas sat on the floor between them, examining a wooden spoon with tremendous concentration. The paper described the operation with the terms of reporting, the number of head and the distance and the conditions, and somewhere in the middle paragraph mentioned the name of the operations manager. Jacob listened with his coffee cup in hand, and his expression, when she looked up from the paper, was the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere and knows it. "You are still the most talked-about man in the territory," Julia said with warmth. "You never talked about me," he said, as he had before, as an ongoing private thing between them. "No," she said, "I did better than that." He smiled at her across the kitchen, across the evening, across the life they had built. "Yes," he said, "you did," Thomas grew. The territory changed around them as territories do, the silver trade shifting, the Apache conflicts easing further south, the railroad extending its reach toward new towns that grew with a speed that older towns found both exciting and faintly alarming. Caldwell Creek grew steadily rather than suddenly, which suited it. In the summer of 1886, the school enrollment reached 53 students, requiring a third classroom that the town funded through a bond issue that Julia had drafted the proposal for and Mayor Aldrich had presented, and which had passed easily. Clara Pierce took the second and third classrooms and Julia the first, and between them they managed a school that the superintendent in Santa Fe cited in his annual report as one of the finest in the territory, which Julia accepted with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has done exactly what she set out to do. The second child arrived in the winter of 1887, another boy, born in January with a snowstorm outside that Jacob weathered by pacing the main room for 3 hours and reading the same page of his book approximately 40 times without absorbing any of it, which Julia learned about afterward from Dr. Patterson and found both touching and entirely predictable. They named the second boy William Henry Garrison, William for Julia's father, whose name had been Guillermo but who had been called William by the English-speaking world he navigated, and Henry for no reason except that it sounded steady, which seemed right for a winter child. William was different from Thomas in the way that siblings are different, not opposite but distinct. Thomas was his father's seriousness applied to everything he encountered. William was, from early on, a child who laughed easily and often, and who found the world primarily interesting rather than requiring management. Julia loved them both with the full specific love that sees each person as themselves and not as a category, and watching Jacob with them was a continual quiet astonishment, because he was with them exactly as he was with her, completely present and genuinely paying attention. He told Thomas about Daniel when Thomas was old enough to ask about the photograph on the mantelpiece, which was when Thomas was 4, with a directness and simplicity that Julia heard from the next room and thought was exactly right. The truth told plainly in a way a child could carry without being harmed by the weight of it. Jacob bought the adjacent parcel of land in 1888, 20 acres to the east of the original Hendricks property, bringing the ranch to 60 acres of good water-right land. He ran cattle on it in partnership with the Harker operation, and had by this point a reputation in the territory that was based on real things, on work and judgment, and the quality of his word, which was worth more in ranching country than almost anything else. The legend of Jacob Garrison, as the story had been told in the early days of his time in Caldwell Creek, was now replaced by something more accurate, which was the understanding of him as a man who had done real things and could be depended on, which was a better story and also a true one. Julia taught for 12 more years in Caldwell Creek, through the territories becoming a state in 1912, which she lived to see with deep satisfaction, and some justified criticism of the constitutional provisions around water rights and indigenous land recognition, about which she wrote letters to the Santa Fe paper that were clear and specific, and that the paper published. Jacob read these letters with the expression he reserved for things she did that confirmed what he had known from the beginning, that she was the most exact and honest thinker he had ever encountered, and that the territory was lucky she had come. The house north of town grew over the years, a room added after William's arrival and another added when Thomas began to need a space that was genuinely his own at 12. The kitchen garden expanding into a real productive garden that fed the household and regularly overflowed into the neighbors' hands. The porch that faced south became the room they lived in most truly, Julia with her papers and her books and Jacob with his, the boys growing and the evenings long in summer and close in winter and always shared. There were hard things. A drought in 1891 that hit the cattle operation severely, and required Jacob and the Harker brothers to make difficult decisions about the herd that were right in the long term, but cost in the short. A fever that took Thomas badly in the winter of 1893 when he was 8 and kept him sick for 2 weeks, and that Julia and Jacob managed through together, alternating the night watches in the way that people do when the work is real, and the fear is real, and the only thing that helps is being present. Thomas recovered fully. The fear was real while it lasted. Mabel Prout died in 1894, which Caldwell Creek mourned genuinely and at length, because she had been the center of its social information in the way that certain people are the center of places without holding any official position, and the dry goods store without her felt emptier than the physical absence accounted for. Julia and Jacob went to the funeral together and held hands through it, which was not a remarkable thing in 1894, but which was something they did because it was true. Old Benny Walsh died in 1895, 90 years old or near enough that the difference didn't matter, and his funeral was the largest the town had seen, the church completely full and people standing in the yard. He had been in Caldwell Creek longer than anyone, and had built more of it with his hands than anyone, and had loved it without reservation, which was a kind of faith. Hector Vega retired from the blacksmith shop in 1898, and his son took it over, and Hector spent his days on a bench outside the shop talking to everyone who passed, which was not very different from what he had done while working, he told Jacob, except now he was doing it sitting down. Mayor Aldrich served 3 more terms as mayor, and then stepped aside for a younger man named Peters who was competent if less entertaining, and the Aldriches retired to a quiet life that was full of garden parties and grandchildren visiting from Albuquerque, which was exactly the life they deserved. Thomas grew up and went to study engineering at the university in Albuquerque in 1903, which Julia had advocated for with a detailed argument about the territory's infrastructure needs that Jacob had listened to and agreed with, and which Thomas had received with the seriousness he gave everything. William went to Albuquerque 2 years later to read law, which surprised no one who had heard him argue at the dinner table from the age of 7. Jacob and Julia were alone in the house north of town for the first time since 1885, and they found that it was, still and continuously, the right place. The house that Jacob had built with the Harker brothers and various neighbors on those Saturdays in 1884 was 20 years older and better for it. The kitchen garden established and generous, the porch worn smooth where their chairs stood, the south windows catching light in exactly the way Julia had argued they should. In the evenings they sat on the porch or at the kitchen table and talked, as they always had, about everything, about the boys and their lives in Albuquerque, which arrived in letters they both read carefully, about the changing territory, about the news from the Eastern papers, about the books they were reading, about the things they had seen and done in 20 years together, which was considerable, and about the things they still intended to see and do, which was also considerable because they were both, constitutionally, people who understood the world as still offering things. Jacob was 50 years old in 1905, and Julia was 46, and they were both in good health, the ranch running well under an arrangement that included a younger man named Samuel who worked the cattle operation with Jacob, and who was clearly eventually going to run it, which Jacob had planned for with his characteristic patient forward vision. Julia was no longer teaching daily, but remained the head of the school board, a position she had held for 4 years, and which she exercised with the same organized directness she had brought to everything. On a September evening in 1905, 21 years after they had sat on the steps of the schoolhouse in the spring dark, and he had told her about the Hendricks property, and she had said a house was a serious undertaking, they sat on the porch of the house that had become their life and watched the sunset over the western ridges, which was doing something spectacular with red and orange in a way that the high desert was given to. Thomas's first child, a boy named Jacob William Garrison, was 3 months old. Julia had spent 2 weeks in Albuquerque in August helping Thomas and his wife Eleanor with the baby's arrival, and had come back to Caldwell Creek with a fullness of feeling that she had not entirely expected, which was the feeling of a life that had become larger than she had planned in the best possible way. Jacob looked at her in the evening light with the same look he had given her at the church in 1884 and at the schoolhouse in the spring of 1884, and on the first night she had told him she loved him, on the Christmas Eve, and on the morning they had ridden out to the North Canyons the first time, and on every significant moment of the 21 years between then and now, the complete and uncomplicated recognition. "Julia," he said. "Jacob," she said. "Are you happy?" he asked. He asked it simply, the way he asked everything that mattered. She looked at the western ridges and at the house behind them, and at the photograph of Daniel Garrison that was visible through the kitchen window on the mantelpiece where it had sat since 1884, and at the man beside her on the porch who had arrived in Caldwell Creek on a black horse and been talked about by everyone and understood by no one, until she had simply sat across from him at a small table and told him the truth about what she thought, and who had told her in return the truth about what he thought, and who had asked her to marry him in October of the year they met, but waited until April to ask the question, because he wanted to be certain enough to deserve the asking. "Yes," she said, "completely." The sunset continued its work on the western ridges, pouring color across the sky above the territory in extravagant quantities, the kind of sunset that the high desert produced regularly enough that you might think you would stop being astonished by it, and that you never actually did. Jacob put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the September evening settled around them with its warmth and its stars beginning to appear at the edges of the sky. In the town of Caldwell Creek, 3 miles south along the valley, the people who had talked about Jacob Garrison for 22 years still talked about him, but what they said was different now. They said he was the best rancher in the territory. They said he and Miss Dawson, who they still called Miss Dawson sometimes out of old habit even though she had been Mrs. Garrison for 21 years, had built something genuine and good, and that it showed. They said the school was the finest in the territory, and that the territory was better for it. Some of the older ones, Hector Vega on his bench and Margaret Aldrich in her garden, remembered the Thursday morning in September of 1883 when the young woman had come off the stage with 2 trunks and a crate of books and a look of focused intention, and how she had walked directly to the general store without looking at anything except what was in front of her. They remembered how she had been too busy to talk about Jacob Garrison while everyone else was talking about nothing else. They remembered, because small towns remember the details of their own stories, that she had been the only one not talking about him. And they understood now, as perhaps they had understood then but could not have named precisely, that her silence on the subject was not indifference. It was something better. It was the refusal to accept a legend in place of a person, the decision to wait and see the actual man, and then to see him clearly, and then to love what she saw completely and with both eyes open, which was, in the end, the only kind of love worth having. The porch held them in the September evening. The stars came out one by one over the territory. The house was warm with lamplight, and the smell of supper and the accumulated presence of 21 years lived honestly together. Below the porch steps, the kitchen garden was going golden with the season, the last tomatoes still on the vine, the herbs Julia had planted in the spring catching the evening light. Jacob said nothing more, and neither did Julia, because there was nothing more that needed to be said. They were both people who understood the difference between silence that was absence and silence that was fullness. And this was the second kind, the kind that held everything that had already been spoken and everything that would be spoken tomorrow, and in all the days after tomorrow that still remained. The territory spread out around their house in all directions, vast and real and ongoing, still wild in the ways that mattered, still requiring of its people the particular combination of endurance and attention, and honest labor that had always been its character. They were part of it in the way that people become part of places when they build real things there. When they plant gardens and raise children and teach other people's children and move cattle across difficult terrain and fix dampers and install windows and sit up through fevers and make promises and keep them. Thomas would write on Sunday, as he did every Sunday, and William the following Tuesday, as he did every second Tuesday. And the letter from Thomas would include news of his son, Jacob William, who was 3 months old and who, according to Thomas, was already showing signs of a particular kind of quiet attention that Thomas recognized from somewhere. Julia would write back to Thomas and tell him that sounded right. Jacob would sit with his coffee and read the letter and look at the photograph on the mantelpiece, and then he would look at Julia across the kitchen table in the morning light coming through the south windows, and the look would be the one it had always been. Complete. Uncomplicated. True. The most talked-about man in the territory had been seen clearly at last by the one woman who had not been talking about him, and what she had seen was worth everything, and what he had found in being seen was the same, and the territory went on around them in its ancient, enduring way, red rock and canyon and sky, and the house stood on its 60 acres north of Caldwell Creek, warm and real, for all the years that came after.